Hi, this is how Boston Scientific improves manufacturing quality using graph analytics. Thank you for being here. I hope you're enjoying Graph Connect so far. We've been told that this FEMA testing thing was delayed, but it was supposed to be during this talk. So if your phone goes off, I guess it was not delayed. So anyway, we'll skip that. All right, my name is Eric Wespi. I work at Boston Scientific, and this is Eric Spiegelberg from GraphAware, and we're going to be presenting together on this manufacturing quality use case that we've implemented at Boston Scientific. So we're going to start off, we're going to give a little bit of an introduction of our companies and us. We're going to talk about some project themes that make sense when you're going about developing a graph project. We'll dive into the business problem and discuss the specifics of the business problem. Manufacturing quality isn't wasn't one of the 6 themes that Emma went through. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that problem, and then how graphs apply to that problem and how that's helped us get some business value. We'll also talk about the evolution of our graph model, so where it started and where it's going. We'll discuss how Boston Scientific, how we extract insights from the graph. And then we'll talk a little bit about additional use cases and future things. The questions will hold till the end and potentially in the hallway, but we're happy to answer any of those after at the end there. Okay, so a little bit about me. Like I said, Eric Wespi. There's 2 Erics here, but I'm the Wespi. I work at Boston Scientific. My entire career background's been in manufacturing, process engineering. Boston Scientific currently, Intel prior to that, and currently I lead a data science team that works on a number of different initiatives. And yeah, my background all in manufacturing and kind of applying analytics to the manufacturing environment. And I have a wife and 2 kids. Okay, Boston Scientific. We are a global medical device company. We make a lot of different therapies that are aimed at making procedures less invasive and have better outcomes for patients. So there's a wide variety of products that we make, including pacemakers, stents, artificial heart valves, lots of different things for diagnostics, and just a lot of things to make us all better. We're a global company, which means we have offices all over, but we also are integrated in terms of we do development, design, and also manufacturing and sales. Okay, I think that's Boston Scientific.
All right, thank you. And I'm Eric Spiegelberg. I'm a senior consultant with GraphAware. I'm also based in Minneapolis with Eric, where I've spent the last 18 years being a Java software developer and architect, primarily working with web-based software, making use of the Spring portfolio. As I mentioned, I'm a member of GraphAware, and we are a consulting company focused on all things graphs. And we focus on consulting, training, software development, and all things focused on Neo4j. 1 second here. We develop our own open source and commercially available tools, frameworks, and products. And that includes over a dozen modules that integrate with Neo4j to provide advanced functionality out of the box. We're also a Neo4j solutions partner, and we're a globally distributed organization, so we have team members in the United States, throughout Europe, UAE, and as well as Australia. And so we are truly frequent speakers and sponsors at graph conferences and meetups around the world, including here today at Graph Connect, where GraphAware is a gold sponsor. So we have a booth out in the right across from the registration area, and we invite you. We'd love you to stop by and say hi. We'll talk about all things graphs. So before we dive into Boston Scientific and how they use graphs to analyze their supply chain, we'll take a moment to just give a little background on how Eric and I found ourselves up on stage presenting here today, and then discuss 3 themes that have emerged from Boston Scientific's project. So the background is that Eric and I met last year at this very conference here in New York, and he happened to come into the booth, and we just had a great conversation about graphs. We discovered that we both lived in Minneapolis, and we said following the conference, Let's get together and discuss opportunities to work together. And this was a great opportunity because it very much fits the pattern of GraphAware, where we like to deliver what we call high-impact consulting, where we transfer our deep and broad, extensive experience with Neo4j to our clients to position them to be successful with their graph projects. So we've got a couple themes that have emerged from the Boston Scientific project. And the first theme is to focus on the business problem. The analysis of Boston Scientific's supply chain is nothing new. And in fact, they've been doing this for years. But the improvement of this analysis has recently fallen to Eric and his group. So they embarked on finding new methods and new technologies that they could improve the output of the analysis. So tasked with finding alternative and improve the methods, they set out to find a solution. And as technologists, it's not uncommon to go off and fall in love with a new shiny object, a new technology, and think to ourselves, I love this and this is what I want to work with. Now how can I apply it to my business problem? And Eric and his group have actively rejected that mentality and have made a conscious choice to stay focused on their business problem. And this has allowed them to maximize the business value that's been gained by Boston Scientific, and it's the business driving technology and not the other way around. So the second theme of our presentation is to use the right tools for the job. So Eric and I are not here to try to convince you that a scalpel is superior to a chainsaw or vice versa, because what is the right tool for the job is directly dependent on your use case, as well as a whole range of factors that are specific to your organization. But what we are here to tell you is that in Boston Scientific's experience and in their adoption of Neo4j, it's been a classic case study in using the right tool for the job. Our third theme is to keep it simple. So Boston Scientific recognizes that their business problems are complex enough and they don't need to make their life harder by adopting a heavyweight, cumbersome process or technology. They did not want to have to hire dedicated, specialized staff with exotic skills and specialist skills whose sole purpose was then to feed the technical machine. Because in doing that, you're not gaining any value for your business. In fact, you might be doing the exact opposite. So that's not to say that Boston Scientific's problems are easy, because in fact, they're really actually quite difficult, but it's the adoption of a simple solution that enabled unlocking the value in their business that otherwise was hiding in plain sight. So at GraphAware, we work with a wide range of customers and clients across the globe, and we think this gives us a vantage point to observe trends and patterns across the graph community. And in working with Boston Scientific, they've been a case study in graph adoption. So as I've said, they started with a business problem. They discovered graphs. They started exploring it, but ultimately they decided to get serious and vet the technology. And this vetting the technology is actually a critically important step, because this is where the quantum leap happens, where an organization goes from merely being a passive observer of the graph community to being an active participant. This vetting of the technology is typically embodied by an organization getting their own and actual data into Neo4j. And this is also a critical step as well, because it forces the organization to evaluate the design decisions and build out their model. And from there, they've actually got the data in a graph, allowing them to write Cypher queries, the query language of Neo4j. And those query language, the Cypher statements, add business value and allow them to gain experience in adopting Neo4j. So at GraphAware, we think we add quite a lot of experience and expertise in this area. And our goal is to work with clients to help them accomplish their goals, to accelerate their timelines, and ultimately to improve the quality of the deliverables. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into Boston Scientific's use case.
Thanks. Okay, so as I mentioned, Boston Scientific is a global company. We're also pretty highly vertically integrated. So we develop medical devices and we produce them. When we manufacture these, we often start with very raw components. So we'll start with a resin or metal, and we'll turn them into these complex devices. And that means there are lots and lots of steps involved. And due to the nature of starting with these raw materials, there's a lot of batch processing involved for many of our products. With batch processing, with complex manufacturing chains, we have multiple teams. Teams are aligned based on the technology that they're using, the process technology they're using, and many devices use multiple technologies, so multiple teams are involved. Because of that, because there are multiple teams, often in different countries, it means we have non-standard analysis methods, and we've discovered that. And when there are non-standard analysis methods and you have a bunch of engineers working on same problems in parallel, a lot of times things end up in Excel. And that's kind of the root of the problem we're trying to solve is all these things ending up in Excel, doing a lot of manual spreadsheet manipulation. So with non-standard analysis, lots of spreadsheet manipulation, we have our investigations aren't as fruitful as they could be. And that's what we're going after. So let me go into a little bit more here. So we have our supply chain mapping. You can imagine a finished good product, and so we make a batch of some device. Maybe there's 100 of those devices, and that's a finished good. And we do some testing when we finish making these things. We do some testing, and we might have a failure of some test. So one of those products failed. We want to investigate that, so we might go and look and see, well, what went into that finished good. That finished good batch, that product batch, consists of a couple different batches of some component, some subassembly. 75 from one batch, 25 from another batch went into that 100. We don't know which one was a failure. And then there might be some other kind of component that fed into that for the final step where we create that finished good. Further upstream, we have other parts going into this that are also mixing batches and going into this value chain. Now, I've explained this a bunch of times to people, and it's always a struggle to explain like a batch processing manufacturing process to people that aren't kind of in that world. So we came up with an analogy for a batch processing use case, and we'll kind of refer to that as we keep going. And the tastiest analogy I could think of was cookies. So let's say we're making a batch of cookies. Pretend we're making a batch of cookies and we want to sell these cookies. And they're delicious cookies. They're going to sell themselves. They're amazing. But we make all these cookies, and before we sell them, we taste one. And one of them doesn't taste very good. Now, if that doesn't taste good, we want to figure out why it doesn't taste good. So in that cookie production, we have batches of frosting. We have batches of dough. Maybe there are multiple batches of dough involved. And then making that dough, we have batches of eggs, different cartons of eggs going into that, different bags of flour going into dough. So if a cookie doesn't taste very good, how do we know what caused that to not be good? Now, I don't know. It's impossible to say which egg went into the cookie or which combination of eggs went into the specific cookie that I tasted because of all the mixing and baking going on. But I can say if I understand that relationship and quantify that relationship, I can understand over time as we build more and more cookies and make more and more batches, we can understand probabilities and assign blame based on that. And so our goal here is to understand where in the supply chain something might have happened in making a cookie that didn't taste good. Okay. Oh, this is you.
So we've said that Boston Scientific has gained business value by adopting Neo4j. Let's go through a couple of the areas where that's the case. And the first area is in performance improvements. The query times of their analytical process has dropped substantially. And this has increased the overall efficiency and helped streamline their entire analytical process. And this is a very good thing. Everybody loves performance improvements. You know, the faster something happens, the better. But interestingly, in Boston Scientific's experience, the largest value that they've gained isn't coming from performance improvements, and instead it's coming from non-functional areas. And these include the simplicity, the explainability, the whiteboard-friendly nature of graphs, and the end result is that the data is much, much more accessible than it otherwise was. So looking at the graph here, this is the portion of Boston Scientific's model that we're allowed to publicly discuss. So we've got a blue node, which is a top assembly, which is a finished product. So in our analogy, this is the cookie. And then the cookie is composed of parts, our green node. And green nodes have a recursive relationship back to themselves. And this is what lets there be dozens and dozens of parts composing one top assembly. Now, Boston Scientific has a very rigid QA process, so they taste every cookie. And if they decide that it doesn't taste well, they can assign a failure to it and relate it back to the top assembly or cookie. So seeing our graph up here on the screen, our graph is actually incredibly simple. And it's so simple, it would be easy to overlook the fact then that what's being presented here truly is a life-saving medical device that Boston Scientific sells millions upon millions of these a year. So in terms of the simplicity of the graph, what is just 3 nodes and 3 relationships is actually a complex medical device composed of dozens and likely dozens and dozens of parts manufactured by Boston Scientific from raw materials. So when you think about the data that that's generating underneath in terms of their process, the end result is millions of finished goods and billions of parts, resulting in billions of relationships generated annually. So while the model is very simple, it's the capture and the easy and efficient navigation of this data and these relationships that add tremendous value. As for explainability, because the model is so simple, it's easy to read, it's easy to write, it's easy to understand, and therefore it's easy to explain to somebody else. So at Boston Scientific, everyone involved with the project across the whole spectrum, maybe from business stakeholders to their technical implementers, are able to understand what they're talking about because they're all speaking the common language. For those same reasons, these graphs are incredibly easy to draw on the whiteboard. And this allows team members, when they're discussing actual production problems, to jump up at the whiteboard and draw graphs using the production data. And not only does that have its own advantages, but what's being drawn on the whiteboard accurately reflects the way that the business understands the problem, the way the technical team understands the problem, and the way that the data is actually organized at the system level. So speaking of data accessibility, we've done some research and we found some surprising statistics that we'd like to share. And the first one is that it's estimated that 90% of the world's data was generated in only the last 2 years. And it's also estimated that that pace of generation is only going to increase. So it used to be the case that if your business had data, that in and of itself was a competitive advantage. But based on statistics such as this, it's easy to conclude that the world is awash in data. And so if everybody has data, you having data yourself is no longer simply a competitive advantage. So what is? We think the competitive advantage is knowing how to go from merely having data to having wisdom from the data. And we found this image that we love, and it's from David Somerville, and we think it tells a very compelling story, and that is that data alone isn't power. It's wisdom from the data that's power. And this wisdom comes from the data's insights and connections and being able to navigate them efficiently, effectively, and reliably so that you can act. And it's this competitive advantage today that is the goal of Boston Scientific's adoption of Neo4j. So as we're talking about areas where Boston Scientific has had business value gained, we first covered performance improvements, then we covered these non-functional areas. The third area is in new capabilities that they've gained from adopting Neo4j. And two of those examples are shortest paths and variable length queries. So shortest path, an example, would be if we started on the left and we wanted to go from node A on the left all the way to node J on the right, but we'd like to do that in the shortest and smallest number of hops possible. This is actually a very common problem across a wide range of industries, including shipping, logistics, transportation, financial industries, networking, and so on and so on. So the utility of the shortest path is actually incredibly useful to have in your business. As for variable length queries, an example would be you may have a particular query that you want to run, so you could pick node F. And using a variable length query, you can constrain or expand the amount of data that's under analysis from N to M hops away, where n and m may be 1 to 5, 15 to 55, or 100 to 155. And it's the ability to constrain or expand that data that's under analysis that is very powerful. So interestingly, both of these problems are actually very difficult to solve, shortest path and variable length queries, particularly as the size of the data set grows. But by no coincidence, these two problems are also strengths of a graph database like Neo4j. So let's go through an example of how Boston Scientific is making use of a shortest path. So to set the stage for that, this is a simple cipher statement, which is the query language of Neo4j. And what this is doing is it's executing Neo4j's shortest path command and passing it a pattern. And the pattern we're interested in says, go from node A to node J following any number of connected relationships. And by putting this into the Neo4j console and merely hitting return, you get this graph below and the problem has been solved. So Boston Scientific is using simple cipher statements like this to find links between failures. So in this graph, we've got two failures represented by the red nodes and a small amount of data between the two failures. And even though it's a small amount of data, it's just enough to make it complicated to figure out what is common between these two failures. Otherwise, this would be a fairly intensive exercise in analysis that could take a lot of time and a lot of resources to accomplish. But using simple cipher statements from Neo4j, Boston Scientific is able to go from this graph to this graph by the execution of a simple cipher statement. It's very clear that the analysis on the right is much clearer than anything you could perform on the left. Excuse me. And so it's simple cipher statements such as this that allows Boston Scientific's analysis to start at step 100 rather than starting at step 0.
Okay, so shortest paths and path queries are really good for seeing linkages between individual failures and investigating individual failures. But once you start to look at that in the aggregate, it can get a little bit scary, right? So looking at this visualization, we can see a few things from it. We can see that there are a number of these red failures. These are all connected to this one subassembly that's way, pretty far upstream of the top assemblies that are the green nodes here. We can understand that there are some. We can understand that they seem to be connected to this one. But it's really hard to then quantify that connection, quantify those relationships just by looking at the nodes in the graph. And so that's where we start to try and extract insights from the graph. So what we do is we use Cypher to generate, quantify the number of paths, the number of connections that lead to a failure, and assign those as properties to all of these individual nodes in the graph. And so to do that, every batch, so every node in the graph gets a score associated with it. We add up the weights of issuance, and so portions of batches of eggs, say, that make up dough, and portions of dough that make up cookies. Aggregating all those together gives each individual batch of eggs or flour or dough a score associated with it, and then we can do some more traditional analysis that would make that'd be a little bit more accessible to management and others. So you can see here that type of data. If you look at on a time frame and you say we have this score that we've calculated in Cypher, extracted out, you can say there's one batch here that seems to be connected. So this y-axis here is basically the amount of failures that might be connected. So there's one batch that seems to be connected to a lot of failures. Another, the second highest one, ran right after it. So we can start investigating a certain place in time. Or we can start to integrate that with other process data and start to do some regression or other type of more traditional analysis from that. So the message there is that we're using Neo4j not really as just a data store, but as a place to analyze data, store those back into the graph, store those new characteristics of the data back in the graph, and then extract that for traditional analysis. Our data science team is based in Python, so or works mostly in Python. So we started off on our journey here, preparing data in Python, building and testing a database using a pretty lightweight connector, Py to Neo. I think that's on the buzzword bingo sheet, so make sure you use that. So we use Py to Neo as a connection to use Python to write cipher statements, build and test that database, and then augment the properties. So we turn the issuance numbers, like 75 from part A get issued to this product one and 25 from part B. We turn those into weights, which removes things makes this dimensionless, which is nice. And then we augment the relationships with a weight, and then we sum those weights for all the paths that could possibly lead to a failure, to all the failures, and store those as properties in a node as a score. And then we kind of developed this in sort of a notebook code environment, but then we had to kind of develop a pipeline through for all this data to kind of go through our Hadoop ecosystem into Neo4j and execute these cipher statements. And for that, we use a partner. They're big in the Midwest. They're our Hadoop partner called PHData. So that they were instrumental in building that pipeline. Okay, so once we've extracted those insights, then we evolve our, that's you.
Then we jump to my slide.
We jump to
So because Boston Scientific's project has been successful in adding business value, there's going to be next steps and an additional phase for the project. And any change we make is going to entail evolving the data model. So we've got a couple lessons we've learned that we'd like to share, and then we'll go through 2 examples of what those next steps will be. So at GraphAware, again, we work with a wide range of clients across the globe, and we see traits of Boston Scientific across many other clients getting started in adopting graphs. And the first point is that many organizations start out by transferring their data into Neo4j very much one-to-one the way it exists in their source systems. And when you're talking about getting started, we think this approach is okay because it follows the crawl, walk, run strategy, and anything that helps you get started adopting graphs we think is a good thing. Now, beyond initial first steps, this strategy may not take advantage of the graph's strengths, and so you might not be maximizing the business value that you could otherwise be taking advantage of. But in just getting started, it's a first step, as we said, crawl, walk, and run. The second point we like to make is that graphs are highly flexible and very easy to change. And so many organizations that are moving to a graph, they're very accustomed to the high barriers and the high costs of changes of other non-graph systems. And this leads to what I like to call the mentality of initial perfection. And it's that feeling of that, well, I've only got one shot, so I've got to get this database perfect. And I have to have it perfect before we launch, because once the ship has sailed, we're going to have to live with this system for the whole lifetime as it is, and we'll be stuck with it. But because graphs are highly flexible and very easy to change, we really try to encourage people to adopt this, avoid this mentality and break themselves of it, because the simple reality is that you can revise and evolve your model very easily as needed. So now let's go through 2 examples of the changes that Boston Scientific are going to do in their next phases. So we return back to the graph that we've seen before, our three nodes, 3 relationships. And currently on the top assembly, this finished product, which is the cookie in our analogy, they have a property with a name of product, which is a string of text that represents what product line this top assembly is associated with. And for reasons that Eric's going to go into shortly, there's been a realization that there would be business value gained by extracting this property off of the top assembly into its own dedicated node, and then creating a relationship from that new node back to the top assembly. So in doing this, we're going to go from our simple 3 nodes and 3 relationships graph to something that looks like this. And what we've added here is the product node that's represented in yellow. And as I said, we've created a has-product relationship back to the top assembly. And then finally, that product property is going to be relocated from the blue top assembly back to the product node itself. And all of this is accomplished by the cipher statement on that screen. We think this goes back to our themes of keeping it simple, using the right tools for the job, and the end result is that then this lets you focus on your business problems and maximize the value you get out of Neo4j rather than working on complex operations of changing your model. The next step that Boston Scientific is considering is the expansion of the data that's included in this analysis. So we're going to be adding supplier information and supplier location data. And interestingly, this data has actually always been available to Boston Scientific, and at least in this analytical context, they've not been making use of it. So if you're not making use of the data you have to you, it is of zero business value. So this is actually an exciting step because by adding data to their graph, they're adding value to the business. So we think this graph then becomes more interesting. So we've got a top assembly, the blue node, that's gone through QA and it's ended in a failure. So the real question is, why did this end in a failure? So moving from the blue node on the left to the right side, it's clear you can see that it's composed of two parts, the two green nodes, and both of those parts have been supplied by the same supplier, the purple node, and yet those two parts were actually supplied by two different facilities. So this could be the key breakthrough in their analysis to understand that perhaps there were conditions at facility 1 that led directly to the cause and the failure of this individual top assembly. And that could be the key root cause that adds the business value, and without that data, they otherwise would never have reached that conclusion.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we come from a background, I didn't grow up on graphs, and so our team was kind of coming from a relational database background, and so we started out thinking all these things should be properties, we just load it as is, and we think, we select things with certain properties, and that was the way to go. So extracting the product as a node itself was kind of a little bit of a mental leap for us. It's like, oh, this should be a separate node. Even though it's a really simple thing to do, it can add a lot of value because we can start to look at things. We can start to learn from one product to another. Another thing that we thought of as we were kind of doing this, we'd analyze one big high volume product and we'd say, okay, we got some insights from this. These are some of the materials that are important, specific batches that we need to go look into. And then we'd go off and do another analysis on another completely different product. Now, those products often are completely disconnected, but sometimes there are some sparse connections between them, and that means we might share the same raw materials way upstream in the graph. And what that means is that a really high volume product that has lots of data that we can learn from can be applied to something like a new product, say, that hasn't finished production yet. If we understand by analyzing this graph that there's a raw material batch that might be suspect in a couple failures, we can then apply that to some new product that is using that raw material batch, but we don't have any data yet for it. So using kind of sparsely connected graphs that are from unique products, we can alert internal users, because they're often in different countries or different organizations, alert internal users of suspicious batches, and then we can also improve our sensitivity to weak signals. So if we have multiple products that have a really weak statistical signal to a certain material type, we can combine those together and improve the statistical power of our testing. So there's a lot of benefits to be had there connecting the different products. Moving on to where we go from here for next steps. We're really excited about some natural language processing use cases. And with that, a lot of times when we have failures or other kind of events in manufacturing, we ask people to enter some text to describe what they found, what they might have done about that. And on a macro level, there's some structure to that. This is what someone entered in the root cause field. But on a micro level, I mean, if you look at that text itself, it's by nature, text is not as structured. And so we're excited about the idea of extracting and correlating topics for that text to understand themes that are emerging about investigations rather than having to read through all this stuff. So if we have a couple different events Maybe these are failures, but we have events associated with them, and they pertain to topics. We can start trending the frequency of topics as they start to arrive, and we can understand, maybe these events both had some description that talked about some equipment maintenance or something, and we can see that equipment maintenance topic is trending, and we need to go look into our maintenance procedures on a specific line. So there's a lot of potential value there that we see. NLP is not the easiest thing to do when you're building it from scratch. But we're excited about working with GraphAware because they're kind of experts in that field. So that's another.
So that brings us back to the partnership between Boston Scientific and GraphAware. As Eric just covered, Boston Scientific has use cases where they can take advantage of NLP, NLU, and possibly machine learning, as well as artificial intelligence. And separately, GraphAware has recognized these trends out in the marketplace, and so we have spent 2 years doing R&D and product development, and the end result is Hume, our new artificial intelligence platform built on top of Neo4j that we're announcing here today at Graph Connect. So we're really excited about Hume, and we have quite a lot of information that we'd love to tell you about it. Rather than slam a bunch of information on the last slide of our presentation, instead we're going to invite you to attend the dedicated Hume session that's happening today at the conference at 4 p.m. Along with that dedicated session, GraphAware, we've got a booth out in the hall across from the registration center. We'd love it if you stopped by the booth to talk about anything and everything all about graphs. And then lastly, you can always find the latest information about all our products and services by visiting graphaware.com. So with that, we'd like to conclude the presentation. So on behalf of Eric Wespi and Boston Scientific, I'm Eric Spiegelberg from GraphAware. We thank you for your time.
Questions? I guess we have time for questions.
Cool. All right, we have time for some questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so we put all this data in the graph. You saw there's a couple different plots that we put together that are the more traditional analysis. Those are kind of presented in a web front end built on Neo4j. So you can imagine you build it's a pretty straightforward, it's internal facing, so we don't have to make it super flashy. Build a straightforward web front end, and you can have JavaScript callbacks that are running Cypher statements, right, to extract certain parts of the data and present those plots. And so we can select given products, given time frames, things like that, and generate those analyses. The other thing we do is our data science team might work with an investigation that's happening and just generate some more custom analysis based on that. That's custom to that investigation. I'd say, we started this like a year ago, so the most readily available data sets are the investigations that are happening kind of retrospectively. But we're getting more into the place where we're starting to launch a product, and we're saying, let's look at some other products that are similar, and what kinds of failures have we seen from those, and what can we learn from those for this new product. So we're starting to get into that space more. We're trying to drive towards more predictive, prescriptive space, like everyone, but it's a lot easier to do retrospective. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question about regulatory requirements. So our source data, not the Neo4j database, but the source data is all regulatory qualified systems. So in medical devices, we have a lot of regulations. So the source data is all in regulated systems. When we put it in Neo4j, that's more thought of as an investigational aid. So we get insights from the graph, and then we go, you confirm that against the source data there. So it's sort of helping the investigation rather than being the only part of the investigation. Sorry, so. Yeah. I would say we're not trying to go in that direction necessarily, where we kind of like, release some material that's a little bit more suspicious. Yeah, we're not looking in that direction. It's more, can we improve the quality of our manufacturing and reduce the incidence of failures? I think maybe in another industry that would be something that could be looked at, but I mean, yeah, it's probably not the direction we're looking to go in right now. Yeah, go ahead. It's a source system. So most of our systems are the data we generate as we manufacture. There are some cases where we're getting data from the vendor. So we have portals where the vendors enter information, and we can take that information and put them into our graph. So that would be a different source system. So you saw Eric talking about facility, supplier data. That type of information would come from a portal where we have an expectation that as we buy materials, the vendor provides us information about those materials through a portal, and it goes into a database. So that would be about as external facing as that data source gets. But most of our data sources are internal and owned, which is nice. Yes? Yes, we've definitely looked into that. So a lot of the manufacturing ones, adding characteristics. So if we were to like evolve this data model to include things about which piece of equipment, maybe which operator, things like that, right? So we've definitely explored that, and we've kind of started down that road. It involves bringing in yet more data sources, so which is always a challenge, but it's one of the things we're looking at. Right now, we're pretty good, and I'd say in the manufacturing space, people are pretty good at understanding those kinds of problems where you understand what's happening in the manufacturing space built on relational databases, but we think there is some value there in augmenting our graph with nodes for describing how that manufacturing happens. So we're looking into that, but we're kind of new in that space right now. Okay, I think that's
all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.